My friends, there is a mystery hidden beneath the soil of ancient prophecy and modern conflict, a name, an operation, a shadow that stretches from the days of the judges to the deserts of Gaza today. And its name is Shimshon. Most know him as Samson, the mighty man of strength. But Shimshon was more than a man. He was a prototype, a prophetic foreshadowing, a divine riddle, a template of what was and what would come again in the fires of warfare and the clash of kingdoms. In the ancient pages of Scripture, there exists a figure who defies natural explanation, a man whose life was marked not by ordinary battles, but by supernatural strength and divine mystery. His name was Shimshon, known to most as Samson. Yet his story was never meant to be just a tale of brute power or personal tragedy. Shimshon stands as a prototype, a prophetic pattern, a divine foreshadowing of spiritual warfare in its rawest form. He was not merely a historical character, he was a symbol, a living parable crafted by God to unveil the secrets of confronting darkness in every age. From his miraculous birth, consecrated under a Nazirite vow, Shimshon was set apart. The angel of the Lord appeared to his parents and declared that their son would begin to deliver Israel from the hand of the Philistines. It was not just a calling, it was a war commission from the womb. He was born into a time of national compromise, a generation where Israel had grown used to subjugation, where they had forgotten how to fight, and worse, forgotten who they were. It is in such times that God raises up prototypes, those who walk differently, who are misunderstood, who don't fit the mold, but who carry the fire of deliverance. Shimshon's strength was not natural. It was not found in training or in weapons. It came from the Spirit of the Lord rushing upon him, and herein lies the mystery. He is the image of the one who wars not by might, not by power, but by the Spirit. He tore apart lions with his bare hands, struck down enemies with the jawbone of a donkey, and carried the gates of the enemy city on his shoulders. Every act was a sign, every movement prophetic. His warfare was not conventional because the warfare of God's people is never truly conventional. It is spiritual. The battles are not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, and the rulers of the darkness of this world. Shimshon represents the believer or servant of God who is thrust behind enemy lines. He operates alone, often misunderstood by his own people. Israel did not rally to his side. Instead, they questioned his defiance, asked him why he provoked the Philistines. Even his own brothers handed him over to the enemy. This is part of the prophetic paradigm. The warrior of God is often rejected by those he is called to deliver, but that rejection only reinforces the prototype, because the true battle is not just external, but internal. It is about identity, calling, and obedience in the face of compromise. His greatest victories often came when he was at his lowest, bound by cords, blinded, humbled, and still the power came. Because the true essence of spiritual warfare is not in the strength of the vessel, but in the presence of God within that vessel. Shimshon's life was chaotic, filled with flaws, yet God used him mightily. This reminds us that spiritual warfare is not waged by perfect people, but by consecrated ones, those who return, repent, and yield themselves again and again to divine purpose. Shimshon's conflict with the Philistines was more than national, it was cosmic. The Philistines worshipped Dagon, a false god. Shimshon's final act, the toppling of Dagon's temple, was a direct confrontation between the kingdom of God and the powers of darkness. He became the weapon. He became the judgment, and in that we see the ultimate prototype of spiritual warfare. The servant of God, fully surrendered, bringing down strongholds not just through strength, but through sacrifice. This is the Shimshon paradigm, a calling to those who will not conform, who carry the fire, who confront darkness not with worldly tactics, but with spiritual authority. His story is not just a history lesson, it is a blueprint. In every generation, when the darkness rises, God raises Shimshons, The conflict in Gaza is not new. It did not begin with rockets, with political borders, or even with modern ideologies. Beneath the surface of every war, there is a deeper war, one that transcends time, geography, and even human understanding. What we witness today in the Gaza Strip is a modern manifestation of an ancient battle, a spiritual conflict that has echoed through the ages. The name may change, Philistines, Hamas, but the spirit remains the same. The war is not simply a clash of cultures or ideologies. It is the reawakening of a conflict that began thousands of years ago, and Gaza stands once again at the center of that battlefield. In the days of old, Gaza was one of the 5 royal cities of the Philistines. It was a stronghold of idolatry, oppression, and resistance against the people of God. It was in Gaza that Shimshon, the judge of Israel, was betrayed, captured, and imprisoned. Gaza was the place where the enemies of God celebrated what they believed was the defeat of his servant. They paraded Shimshon in mockery, binding him, blinding him, thinking they had conquered not just a man, but the power behind him. Gaza became a symbol, not merely of territory, but of rebellion, spiritual warfare, and the counterfeit power of false gods. Today, Gaza rises again, not in the name of the Philistines, but under the banner of Hamas. Yet the resemblance is unmistakable. A land that remains in perpetual conflict, a stronghold of terror, a launching ground of attacks against Israel. But even more, it is a spiritual epicenter, a mirror of the past. The same rage, the same defiance, the same desire to eradicate the covenant people of God. The names are modern, the weapons are advanced, but the war remains as ancient as the judges. The battles fought by Israel in the time of the judges were not just political or military in nature. They were spiritual wars. Each enemy represented a deeper force, a principality that sought to control territory, minds, and destinies. The Philistines were not just enemies of Israel, they were guardians of a spiritual gate. They stood in opposition to the fulfillment of God's purposes through his people. So it is today. Gaza remains a gate, and just as in ancient times, it seeks to prevent Israel from walking fully in its destiny. Gaza, in the days of Shimshon, was a place where covenant and compromise collided. Israel had grown weary of fighting. Many accepted Philistine rule. Some were willing to surrender their own deliverer to keep the peace. It was in that same atmosphere of spiritual fatigue that Shimshon rose, a one-man resistance. He walked alone into the enemy's camp, set their fields on fire, carried their gates upon his back, and ultimately tore down the center of their power. His battle was not just against men, it was against systems, ideologies, and dark dominions. Likewise, what we see in Gaza today is not just geopolitics, it is prophecy unfolding. The fire that burns there is ancient. The hatred that fuels attacks is inherited. The cries for destruction are not merely political, they are spiritual echoes. The same spirit that sought to bind Shimshon seeks now to bind a nation. The same spirit that rejoiced at his captivity rejoices at every loss Israel suffers. The temple of Dagon may have crumbled, but the spirit behind it searches for new altars and new worshippers. And yet, in the very place of captivity, God moves. Shimshon's greatest act of deliverance came not in freedom, but in chains. And Gaza, though it seeks to be a place of destruction, may again become the setting of divine confrontation. Just as the ancient judge confronted the enemies of God within its walls, so too today the conflict in Gaza holds a deeper purpose, a clash not only of armies, but of kingdoms. Operation Shimshon was not just a tactical maneuver on a military map. It was not merely the movement of troops, the execution of strikes, or the neutralization of targets. It was, whether recognized or not, a reenactment of an ancient template, a divine pattern that reaches far beyond military strategy into the realm of the prophetic. The operation bore the marks of something much older than modern warfare. It echoed the actions, the spirit, and the mission of the original Shimshon. It was a prototype in motion, one that emerges when natural means fall short and something deeper is required, when the battle is no longer just of the earth, but of the heavens. In the ancient days, Shimshon did not fight with an army. He did not lead battalions or command ranks. He operated alone under the anointing of the Spirit, moving with divine impulse into enemy territory. He crossed boundaries, entered strongholds, and disrupted the enemy's sense of security from within. He tore down gates, ignited fields, and struck fear into the hearts of the Philistines, not because he followed a human strategy, but because he embodied a divine one. This was the essence of the prototype, a disruptive force sent into the heart of enemy ground to confront entrenched power and bring down strongholds from the inside. Operation Shimshon, in its very conception, mirrored this paradigm. It was not about occupying land, but about dismantling capabilities. It was not launched to negotiate terms, but to strike at the core of enemy infrastructure. The very name Shimshon speaks of force, sudden impact, and prophetic symbolism. Naming the operation after such a figure was not merely symbolic, it was spiritual. It was a declaration of the nature of the mission, infiltration, confrontation, and the collapsing of demonic architecture. Modern warfare often operates in visible realms, airstrikes, surveillance, intelligence, but when a military action aligns with a prophetic pattern, it enters another dimension. Operation Shimshon carried the fingerprint of something higher, something that stirred the unseen. Gaza, a place historically known for captivity and spiritual rebellion, became once again the setting for a confrontation between two realms. Just as Shimshon once entered Gaza alone, pulled down its gates, and later destroyed the temple of its god, so this operation functioned in that same archetype, penetrating deep, targeting tunnels, command centers, and hidden weapons caches buried beneath civilian facades. It was a confrontation not just with flesh and blood, but with the structures of darkness that hide behind walls and rhetoric. The very nature of the prototype is to go ahead of the many, to pioneer a form of warfare that is not bound by the conventions of man. Shimshon was unconventional. He used the jawbone of a donkey, lit foxes' tails with fire, carried iron gates across miles. Operation Shimshon mirrored that unorthodox spirit. It moved swiftly, unpredictably, breaking the mold of conventional engagements. The prototype reveals that in times of deep spiritual conflict, God does not always send multitudes, He sends instruments. He sends those whose methods appear strange, even reckless, but who are appointed to shake the very foundations of enemy power. This pattern also reveals something deeper about divine timing. Shimshon's final mission came at the lowest point of his life, bound, blind, and mocked, and yet it was there that he fulfilled his greatest purpose. Likewise, modern confrontations that appear to be desperate or reactive may in truth be divinely timed acts of reckoning. When evil entrenches itself behind layers of deception, God sends forth a Shimshon, not to linger or negotiate, but to strike, to shake, and to topple. Operation Shimshon, therefore, was not simply about immediate results. It was a manifestation of a heavenly blueprint. The rise of Hamas in the modern age bears the unmistakable resemblance to the spirit that once empowered the Philistines in ancient times. Though the names are different, the tactics updated, and the faces changed, the spiritual essence behind both remains consistent: a hatred for the covenant of God, a rebellion against His purposes, and a violent opposition to the people through whom He works. The Philistines were not merely a regional enemy of ancient Israel. They represented a system, a spiritual force cloaked in culture and politics, that sought to extinguish the light of the chosen people. So too does Hamas, standing as the modern vessel of that same ancient hostility. The Philistines occupied the land that was to be part of the inheritance of Israel. They fortified their cities, armed themselves for war, and positioned themselves as the gatekeepers of Gaza and its surrounding regions. They were not just territorial enemies, they were spiritual obstacles. They served gods of stone and idols of death. They upheld values antithetical to the law of Moses. In their very existence, they challenged the sovereignty of God's rule in the land. Their warfare was not merely to expand territory, it was to defy the divine claim over Israel. Every battle with them was a clash of covenants. When Hamas arose, it did so under the banner of resistance and revolution. It wrapped itself in the language of politics, nationalism, and religious fervor. But beyond the visible, it carries the same contempt for God's covenant that stirred the Philistines. The charter of Hamas openly calls for the destruction of Israel. Its ideology is rooted not just in territorial disputes, but in the eradication of an entire people whose existence testifies to the faithfulness of God. It is not only a political or military threat, it is a spiritual manifestation of an ancient enmity. The rise of Hamas within Gaza mirrors the rise of the Philistines in the same region. Both fortified themselves within a territory that stood in direct opposition to the covenantal destiny of Israel. Both used violence and terror as tools of intimidation. Both sought not merely to occupy land, but to possess spiritual authority over it. Gaza became once again the stronghold of rebellion. It is no coincidence that the same location that once held Shimshon in chains is now home to militant tunnels, arsenals, and strategic warfare against Israel. This is not to say that every conflict is a mere repetition of history, but rather that history often unveils deeper spiritual patterns. The Philistines were allowed to rise as a test, as a confrontation, as a mirror to the state of Israel's obedience. When Israel fell into compromise and forgot its covenant, God allowed enemies to arise, not to destroy Israel, but to awaken it. In the same way, the presence of Hamas is a signal. It testifies that the battle is not over, that the forces of darkness have not retreated, and that the ancient war has simply found a new vessel. The tactics of Hamas, hiding weapons in schools, launching attacks from civilian areas, using propaganda as warfare, may seem modern, but they are deeply rooted in the deceptive nature of the enemy of God's people. The Philistines too used strategy, manipulation, and the exploitation of Israel's weaknesses. They sought to erode Israel from within, to dull its spiritual edge, and to replace its prophetic voice with the silence of submission. Understanding Hamas as a spiritual successor to the Philistines is not about labeling, but about discernment. It allows one to see the true nature of the conflict and to respond not just with force, but with clarity. The war is not only about land, it is about covenant. The resistance is not merely against a nation, it is against a destiny. When the Philistines rose, God raised Shimshon. And in every generation, when the same Spirit returns in new forms, God raises up a response that is both prophetic and powerful. The life of Shimshon reveals a mystery hidden beneath the surface of his triumphs and tragedies, the intertwining of judgment and redemption within a single vessel. His story was not neat, not polished, not easily packaged for moral instruction. It was raw, filled with contradiction, driven by impulse, and yet woven by divine purpose. The paradox of his life lies in this. Through his failings, God moved. Through his weakness, strength emerged. And through his judgment, redemption began to take form. This is the paradigm embedded within the prototype. Shimshon was not simply a man of strength. He was a vessel of divine collision where justice met mercy and where wrath prepared the way for deliverance. Shimshon's actions often seemed impulsive, disconnected from divine order. He married outside the covenant. He touched what was forbidden. He pursued his own desires. And yet, each of these steps brought him closer to the heart of the enemy, deeper into their territory, and eventually to the epicenter of their power. He lived a life that, on the surface, looked like personal failure, but beneath the surface, it was being directed by an unseen hand. He was a judge, not in the courtroom, but in the theater of spiritual warfare. His mission was not to teach, but to break, to confront, to shake the foundations of a system that opposed God. Judgment and redemption are often seen as opposites, but in the biblical pattern, they are inseparable. One clears the ground for the other. Before there can be redemption, there must be a reckoning. Before the temple of Dagon can fall, the pillars must be shaken. Shimshon's final act was one of judgment. He brought down the temple, crushed the leaders, and dismantled the power structure of the Philistines. But in that judgment, a new beginning was forged. Israel was awakened. The oppression was broken, hope was ignited. His death, though tragic, birthed a shift in the spiritual atmosphere. His fall became Israel's rise. This is the same pattern that has unfolded throughout history. When Israel went astray, God raised voices, sometimes warriors, sometimes prophets, who brought hard words, difficult truths, or actions that broke the status quo. These were not gentle shepherds, but fiery messengers, those who embodied judgment to pave the way for grace. Shimshon, though blind and bound, became that kind of vessel. In the place of his greatest humiliation, he fulfilled his greatest purpose. The collapse of the temple was not only the end of his life, it was the beginning of a deliverance. This paradigm stretches beyond the story of Shimshon and reaches into the heart of every conflict where God is at work. In modern times, when we see eruptions of violence, shaking, and sudden collapse, they may appear as chaos or judgment. But through the eyes of the prophetic, they may also be the preparation for redemption. Gaza, the place of Shimshon's final battle, has once again become a stage of conflict, and within it, the same dynamic unfolds. Judgment is not simply wrath. It is a shaking of foundations, a breaking of false altars, a removal of what hinders the purposes of God. Shimshon's final moment was a return. In blindness, he remembered. In captivity, he cried out. In weakness, he touched the pillars, and God moved. The spirit that had once rushed upon him in his youth returned in his brokenness. This is the pattern. The same hand that strikes can also heal. The same act that brings down can lift up, and the same judgment that ends a season can open the door to a new one. In Shimshon, the two forces became one. Judgment was not the end, but the hinge through which redemption turned. The ruins became the altar, the ashes, the soil for something yet to rise. There comes a time in the progression of a nation, a people, or a generation when the ordinary is no longer sufficient, when the systems begin to shake, and when the darkness that once hid in the shadows begins to rise in open defiance. In such times, God does not merely strengthen the established structures. He raises up a different kind of person, those who are not polished by the world, not molded by comfort, but forged in the fire. These are the Shimshons of their time. They do not follow the crowd, they do not seek approval, and they are not driven by diplomacy. They are bold, they are raw, they are uncompromised, and they emerge when the shaking begins. A generation may seek ease, but the purposes of God are not carried out in ease. They are carried out in collision, in conflict, in consecration. Shimshon did not live in a time of victory. He lived in a time of occupation. His people were under oppression, yet most had learned to live with it. They made peace with compromise, adjusted to defeat, and accepted a reality far beneath their calling. But one man refused. One man burned with a fire that would not let him stay silent. Shimshon rose not because he was invited, but because he was appointed. He did not wait for consensus. He was driven by covenant. The call for bold, uncompromised warriors does not come to the many, it comes to the few. And it often comes when all others are silent. These are those who will not be tamed by culture, silenced by fear, or lured by gain. They speak when others are afraid to speak. They stand when others bow. They move when others hesitate. They are not shaped by the applause of men, but by the voice of God. Shimshon's strength came not from himself, but from the Spirit that came upon him. He did not strategize his acts. He yielded to the impulse of heaven. He was dangerous not because of his muscles, but because he was untethered from the fear of man. The world does not know what to do with such people. Even the religious often recoil from them. Shimshon's own people rebuked him for stirring up trouble. They handed him over to the enemy to keep the peace, but peace built on fear is not peace. It is bondage, and God will not let his purposes rest in bondage. He sends the ones who disturb the silence, who ignite the fire, who walk into the lion's den and tear the beast apart. Not because they are fearless in themselves, but because they are possessed by something greater. In times of shaking, the true foundations are revealed. That which cannot be shaken remains. The rest is swept away. God allows shaking not to destroy, but to expose, to refine, to awaken. When everything familiar begins to tremble, when institutions falter, when the future feels uncertain, that is the hour of the warrior. That is the moment for the ones who have oil in their lamps, fire in their bones, and steel in their spine. They do not look back. They do not hesitate. They know that the time is not later. It is now. The boldness of Shimshon was not rebellion. It was obedience. His defiance of the Philistines was not personal vengeance. It was prophetic action. Every blow he struck, every gate he carried, every stronghold he touched bore the imprint of a higher war. In this hour, the same call goes forth, not to those content with safety, but to those who long for the shaking that leads to glory. It is a summons to rise, to confront, to step into the breach, and to carry the flame of divine confrontation into the heart of the darkness. This is not the time for silence or hesitation. It is the time of the uncompromised, the ones who carry heaven's mandate and will not stop until the pillars fall. And so we stand at the threshold of an ancient mystery reborn in modern fire. The spirit that moved in the days of Shimshon has not vanished. It rises again, dressed in new names, operating in familiar defiance. Gaza burns not just with rockets, but with prophecy. The battle rages not only in streets and skies, but in realms unseen. Operation Shimshon was more than a mission. It was a sign, a signal that heaven still moves in the affairs of men, that God still raises those who will not bow, that even in darkness the pillars can fall. This is not the hour for retreat. It is the hour to rise, to discern the times, to see through the smoke and know what it means, to walk not in fear but in fire. The prototype has been revealed, a boldness that does not conform, a courage that does not flinch, a people who will not trade covenant for comfort. Let the watchers awaken, let the warriors prepare, for the shaking has begun and the gate is once again trembling. The pillars are waiting. The question is not if they will fall, but who will rise to bring them down.